For over 50 years, Sir Mark Prescott has been training racehorses from his Heath House stables in Newmarket. He has nurtured the careers of Group 1 winners and been the architect of numerous handicap plots, orchestrated with meticulous care and precision. But the charismatic third Baronet is much more than a racehorse trainer. He is an innovator, a thinker, a bachelor, a boxing referee, a mentor, a bullfighting aficionado, and so much more. He is a true racing legend. Sir Mark, lovely to see you, and thank you for having us to Heath House. It's always a pleasure to be here.
I hope it'll be a pleasure anyway, and I hope it'll be what you want.
50 years ago, you trained your first winner, Belle Royale, at Stockton, April 71. Memories rich on that?
Yeah, it was a great day. I mean, your first winner, like your first kiss, you never quite forget it. However many more you may have later on, there's only one first, isn't there? And so I remember her very well with great affection. She'd been a good 2-year-old with Mr. War, who I'd started with, and then she'd missed a year, and she came back and started well there. Won a big handicap at York afterwards. Eric Eldon, great stylist, still alive, I'm glad to say, rode her. He rode very much like Joe Mercer, very neat, very polished style. And he'd been with Ryan Jarvis. No, it was a great day.
Yeah, and was it always the plan for you to train racehorses? When did you first become aware of the great sport of horse racing?
It's easy, I can tell you when I became aware. I was keen to learn to ride because there was sort of pretty girl down the road who rode, and I thought it was about time I learnt, and I was about 11, I suppose.
This was down in Devon,
In Devon, yeah. And there was a very nice lady called Frances Selly, and she taught me to ride. And I loved it so much, I used to cycle down to her farm and do all the mucking out. And she wouldn't accept any money for teaching me from my stepfather. And so he felt that he ought to do something for her. She loved racing, so we went to Newton Abbot races. And we parked by the last fence. I was too small to see over the fence. And they came hurtling around the turn. In those days, it was just the one fence and then you were home at Newton Abbot. They hadn't brought in that land at the far end. And Tim Brookshaw came flying round the turn, going for hell, rock hard ground on a chestnut. And I couldn't really see over the fence, but I could hear him shouting, "Yeah, whack, whack, whack," and this thing ploughed through the fence. And it somersaulted right in front of you. And as you know, racing, you can be so close. And it came thudding down on top of him, right in front of me. Brought down another one. Another horse went round him and the jockey fell off, so there were 3 on the deck, and I was peering over the rails. And very, very slowly, first one horse got up, then the other, and the great man rose very, very slowly and chucked his stick into the crowd, walked back up the track. I thought, what a man, what a man. And I never wanted to do anything else. So he was entirely because of Tim Brookshaw.
Yeah.
And Chris Pitt was writing an autobiography of him last year or the year before, rang up and asked me about Tim. I told him this story and I said, you know, it's probably complete nonsense. You know what it's like. Your memory plays tricks on you. He was absolutely right. The horse, the date, everything was absolutely correct. So it burnt itself into my memory.
Yeah.
And I always think it's the noise. It's the noise that's so exciting of racing. And if you got new people, you want to bring them down close to the noise, at the horses and the jockeys.
At full gallop?
Yes.
Yeah.
Not the crowd and the bookmakers.
Yeah. The pure adrenaline rush. Yeah. And it didn't come from your father then, this interest? 'Cause, I mean, sadly you lost your father when you were young.
Yes, father was a lawyer and a farmer and very tricky. We had a very exciting time with him. No day was dull. He had a very, very short temper and a very good sense of humour. But it prepared me for Mr. War and Mr. Kendall and the inevitable rockets that I would get during my brief riding career.
And your stepfather, you came quite close when your father passed. Your stepfather and you formed a good
I've got a marvellous stepfather, and aren't you lucky? And mother, I suppose, like a lot of us, had the same type of person, and father and my stepfather were very similar people, and she was obviously attracted to that sort of person. And when I inherited my stepfather, who was also a farmer, I can remember wanting to be difficult, and he came in to say good night, and I was sitting there with my arms folded, and he said to me, he said, now then, he said, I don't want you to think you've got to like me. And I said, well, I shan't. He said, good. And he said, don't think of me as your father, will you? I said, I certainly shan't. No. He said, good. He said, don't forget, I don't have to like you either much. Good night. And turned out the light. And the next morning I was cleaning his shoes. So he had the measure of me very early on.
Did.
And my big regret really is, and I think it's probably the biggest regret of my life, was that I got chucked out of all these schools and was no good at anything. And he died just before I became relatively successful at something. And I really, really regret, because he'd have loved all the nonsense about Pasternak and betting and he'd have loved all that, you know.
Yeah.
I regret it very much. Yeah.
Well, isn't there to love on that one? We'll come to that, I hope, soon. Tell us about the baronetcy then, please.
Well, I inherited the baronetcy at a most inconvenient time when I was just going to start work for Frank Kendall. And I can assure you, being called Sir Mark Prescott and living in the lads' hostel at Aston Tyrrell, it is not an advantage to have a title. And my father, of course, by then was dead. My Uncle Richard, lived in Toronto, and would have been absolute to my grandfather's horror, ran a nightclub called the Baronette's Bar, and he died without any children. And no money either.
The Baronette's Bar didn't
yeah,
do so
that's
good.
right. So I just got the name. But it was my grandfather who got it, who was Sir William, and he was a self-made man. He became chairman of the Metropolitan Water Board. He built most of the reservoirs you see around London when you fly in from Heathrow. And for all of us racing people, he built Kempton the Kempton Park Waterworks, which is at the
Still there.
That great there. And the engine there that pumps the water 12 miles, there's two engines. One's called Bessie, after my grandmother, and the other's called Billy, after my grandfather. And they're still there in working condition, and a wonderful group of enthusiasts keep them going, but it takes 2 or 3 days to get the pumps going. So, but every year they do open at some point, and it's well worth a visit.
Oh, wonderful. What a great legacy.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
But Grandpa, he was very fiery as well. So I came.
So it's in the genes.
It certainly is, and you had to be able to put up with a rocket or two, yeah.
I mean, how was it for you then as a young teenager? I mean, you were riding as an amateur rider as well with the lads there.
I had a
was
wonderful
it quite
time. I wasn't any good,
Yeah.
but I was enthusiastic, and I'd started with Sid Koenig and his son, who were so kind to me, and I owe them everything. Without them going there and having such a wonderful time, I owe them everything, and I can never repay them. Neil, battling away, lives on his own, all sorts of terrible things, but he's never say die, and so far he's all right. But the injured jockeys are simply wonderful to him. Yeah.
Good to hear.
So they're marvellous people. Mr. Koenig, still the best horseman I've ever seen.
And this was down at King State?
Yes, entirely self-taught.
Yeah.
Original man, had a different way of looking at animals. By the time they come to me, all these difficult horses, he said they've been knocked about plenty. We've got to find another way. And he always would. He always would. Mischievous. Nothing was too serious, and we saw horses that did everything we saw them do everything. And I can't tell you how grateful I am. And then he got me the job with when I finally got chucked out of Harrow, Mr. Koenig secured the job for me with Frank Kendall.
Did you get chucked out of Harrow?
I did.
And the reason being?
Well, it was a bit of form, really.
Yeah.
I had got a bit of form, but the final success was putting a whoopee cushion under the preacher on Founder's Day, which
That was the end.
was a success beyond my wildest dream.
Some might say
And
very deliberate.
my stepfather then was summoned to collect me, and I went back home, and I started with Mr. Kendall the next day.
Right.
He was not amused.
And how was Mr. Kendall?
Tough.
Yeah.
Tough. Marvellous placer of horses. He did everything correctly, and he place. I mean, we had Crudwell when I was there, who's forgotten now. The race, as you rightly said, was run at Warwick the other day. Most people will think it's the Village, but it was named after this horse who won 50 races. He won 50 races with it. It's just unbelievable. He placed in Ascot Gold Cups, won the Alexandra Stakes, placed in a Gold Cup, and age 14 or 15 he finally won his 50th race. And he was no good by then. But Mr. Kendall preserved his mystique, and he won an optional cellar at Taunton. One of the happiest days of my life was waiting to hear, I wasn't there, but waiting to hear if he'd won.
You were 17 years old when you broke your back at Y Racecourse, and you were hospitalised for 18 months.
Yes.
I mean, that is a heck of a long time.
It was the most important thing that ever happened to me.
I was going to say, I mean, what do you remember most about that, apart from it being a time perhaps of
no
sheer...
pain. No pain.
Really?
No pain at all.
Yeah. Do you remember the fall?
Yes. I brought them down, or somehow we got brought down on the turn. Y was 7.5 furlongs round with what they call adverse camber now on the road. And it was May, and they had a bit of rain on very firm ground. And I brought down Bill Turner, who's now trained 2-year-olds very well.
Yeah.
And we were both whisked off to hospital. I knew they mustn't move me. I knew something absolutely terrible had happened. It was like being in warm water. And I went to tell them not to touch me, and I realised that I couldn't speak. And then I realised I couldn't blink. And I was seized with the most terrible, terrible fear, which didn't leave me for 8 or 9 weeks, I suppose. That terrible fear that you could be like this for the rest of your life. And if you live to be 90 and never able to communicate with them, your tongue was pegged back so it didn't go down your throat. Yeah. And your eyelids stuck to your eyeballs unless they remembered to come in. Nobody who hasn't had it can imagine, I don't think you can imagine possibly how terrifying it is.
I can't imagine.
So you've had a glimpse, really.
Yeah.
And then I got moved. I went to
life-changing.
I went to Ashford Cottage Hospital, which wasn't a success. And then I got moved to Oswestry Orthopaedic, where the first visitor I had to was Tim Brookshaw. Now then, boy, he says, "What are you doing here?" I said, "It's entirely due to you."
Back to the old Newton Abbot.
My hero was there. And Oswestry was marvellous, and eventually I hobbled down to there. Yeah.
Right. Was Tim Brookshaw still riding then?
No. He'd had this terrible fall.
Right.
And the Injured Jockeys Fund was to look after him and Paddy Farrell, who'd been injured within weeks of one another.
Yes.
And no, he was unable to walk but flying around.
Right. Yeah. An extraordinary man.
Yes. Determined, quite formidable. It wasn't nothing soft about him.
A hard nut.
But a hard man. A good hard man.
Yeah. And very influential on you.
Very.
Do you ever think about that fall now and how
Yes,
things might
every
have been?
day of my life.
Do you really? Do you really? I bet you do. Do you count your lucky
Every
stars?
single day at some point.
Fair play to you.
And I think also that you're besieged with the thought that it's very important that what you do as well as you can, and it matters. But equally, if you have two run badly at Carlisle, it is not the most important thing in the world, even if there are people who think it is. So I think it's
perspective is everything, isn't
I think
it?
It was a terrible thing to happen. But if you come out the other side, probably you're very lucky because you've had a glimpse of the abyss.
And when did you know you'd come out of it then? And when
8 weeks.
In 8 weeks?
It's the first time I felt my feet.
Right. It gradually all came
8
back.
weeks. And then there was a torture of it coming back, and it was rather like being in a bath with water filling. And it was almost torture then because you felt that that you weren't improving fast enough, and it was going to stop at just your feet. What's good that to me?
Oh.
Everything you needed was higher, and so it was a horror, really.
Goodness me! And here we are now, all these years later. In a way, I think it's wonderful that you ended up being at Heath House, because if ever a yard ever suited a personality, then this one suits you.
Yeah,
doesn't it? And
I love it. I love it. I mean, we're all slaves to our home or our property. I'm a complete slave to this place, and I loved it. And as soon as I came here to work for Mr. War, I felt at home, and I felt a success. And at Frank Cundall's, I never felt I was doing well. And here, luck went my way straight away, and I've just loved Newmarket, liked the people, loved the house. And hopefully someone else will have it and it'll go. So William's got to make it go after me, and he will.
You've talked about a shared license with William a few years ago.
He's
Is
not
that
small
still
enough type for his name.
Brilliant. All right.
But I have told him, and of course it's very bad news for him at the moment too, with Jim Bolger 80 or whatever it is, first or second in the classic. I said to William, there's more bad news today.
Yeah. Indeed.
But
all the oldies
no,
doing
he'll
well.
do it very well. He'll do it very well. But Mr. War virtually gave it to me, and so I've always felt that it was a sort of onus on me to do the same. Yeah.
And this fella here was trained here.
St. Simon,
What
greatest horse in
legacy.
Yeah, he was in the Millennium Poll in America. To everybody's surprise, I think he was elected the greatest racehorse of all time. Of course, he was before Frankel, so who knows whether it would be Frankel nowadays, but that's my Berm. It's a marvellous thing, isn't it? You can see every rib and every vein, and just an extraordinary horse he must have been.
Yes.
There's a picture of him in my feed house, and it was taken when he was 19, and he still looks like a horse in training. So he obviously had extraordinary vitality.
Yes. Talking about superstar horses, because you began to emerge, didn't you, as a shrewd placer of horses quite early on, but with Spindrifter and Misty Halo, that brilliant mare.
I think it needs must when the devil drives, because there wasn't a good horse early on so it was rather like those westerns, when they're pinned down under the boulder and they have running out of ammunition, and the fellow used to say, make every bullet count and don't fire till you see the white of their eyes. And so you've got a limited number of horses that you could manipulate, and it was important that they won as many races as possible.
Well, Spindrifter won 13, didn't he, out of 19 starts, and he equalled the record at the time.
At the time, he beat the Bard's record, which had stood for 100 years, which was winning 10 consecutive races in a season. And then he equalled Nagwa's record. Barry Hills had trained Nagwa. And fascinatingly, Nagwa and Spindrifter's mothers were in the same field in Ireland, and Joe Crowley had bred them both, who's Aidan O'Brien's father-in-law.
Yes.
So he'd bred them both. And Spindrifter, he was owned by the right man, Mr. Waters, who owned a caravan park and never missed a runner. And so he drove all over the country watching the horse win. And years later, I think poor Mrs. Waters, he was watching all those very early recordings in the 80s. Spindrifter winning all these races when he couldn't sleep. So he was extraordinary, you know.
I looked at his record the other day. I think the most southern race course was Leicester.
Probably.
Yeah.
And
nearly all of them, well, they were all up north.
They were mainly,
Yeah.
and they were all condition races, not
Yes.
one a race value 2,500.
Amazing.
That was the art. And once I'd sort of spotted that, we worked backwards. And I remember saying to Mr. Waters, you can either have a crack at winning the Windsor Castle or a crack at winning 10 or 15 races. Which do you fancy? You can't do both. Once the once you've won over a certain amount.
Yeah.
So Mr. Waters said, "Oh, let's win the races," and so we did. The fascinating thing was that at the end of the year, having won 13 races, what do you think, or you may know, what do you think his weight he was allotted in the free handicap?
Oh, I would say it was surprisingly low, something like 8 stone or something.
Marvellous guess, 713.
Was it? Goodness me.
So he'd won all those races.
That gave you a lot of pleasure, didn't it?
Yes,
Yeah,
it
fair
did.
play.
And then, of course, I was congratulating myself on being such a fantastic trainer. When along came Bill O'Gorman and did it twice more, absolutely no trouble
Presidio.
with Presidio and Timeless Times. And then the Jockey Club and everybody got fed up with us all and changed all the races. So Uncle Bill, he did phenomenally well.
And Misty Hello 125. So didn't
Yes,
quite do it
she
quite
was
well.
different cup of tea. Again, it was not one a race value so much. And all amateur races then really were condition races. And she was the best horse around who hadn't won a race value, 1,500 or whatever it was. And she never, I think I'm right in saying, she never won a race by less than 1.5 lengths. So she was pretty cute. And she'd either go ping, or if it was nasty, she'd get beat, you know. But Elaine Mellor used to ride her to perfection. And Elaine was, at that time, really well ahead of the other girls.
Yes.
Make and Shape and Stan in the background. She was pretty efficient.
Yeah, yeah.
And she won the Diamonds twice on Mandalas for me. Do you remember that?
I do.
The Oppenheimers very
Yes,
generously
on
gave
King
us-
George Day.
Yeah. And the champion lady rider used to get a car as well. So there was Elaine dripping in diamonds, riding around in a car which I had acquired for her. And as soon as she retired, she said it was iniquitous that these races were all condition races and they must be made into handicaps immediately. And that was the end of it. So having kitted her up, she torpedoed me.
Talk about gratitude and all that.
Yeah.
Goodness me. And we've got to mention as well Mustafi. Seven wins in 17 days in July of...
Well, he was owned by Mr. Waters as well.
Yes, that was an amazing coincidence.
Who'd had Spindrifter, and he was closely related to Spindrifter, and he won 7 in 17 days, was it? Yeah. And they were everywhere.
Yeah,
they went
they were.
Southall and Brighton and Hamilton and up
Musselburgh.
and down the country, Musselburgh. And that was his feat, really, because you can imagine somebody doing it in America where they're racing on the same track and not having to travel, or even during the winter. We had a horse called Fall in Line who won 6 in 12 days or something. But he was only going to Lingfield and he was always back here, you know, and he just nipped off. I think Mustafi's, that travelling on top of it all was an amazing horse, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And you probably said before, but we used to trot him up in the morning after he'd won and think we can't run him again, you know. We used to jog him up about 5 o'clock in the morning. He'd only got back at 9:30 or 10. Jog him up and he'd shake his head. Off you go. Anyway, when he'd won 7, he didn't shake his head anymore. But it was a
That was
wonderful
the signal,
run.
was it?
It was
Yeah,
a wonderful run. Yeah.
And he was related to Spindrifter too,
Very
wasn't he?
closely. He was
Yeah,
out
yeah.
of Spindrifter's sister's daughter. He was
Goodness.
out of, yeah.
And do those sort of horses, Sir Mark, give you as much pleasure as your Group 1 winners do?
They do me because I
Yeah.
feel I've put more into them.
Yeah.
The Group 1s I've been lucky enough to have, they were horses with plenty of ability. And I think you don't feel, rather like a schoolmaster probably, the very talented child. It's marvellous to have and wonderful to see them do well, but perhaps schoolmasters are the same, I don't know. And the child that perhaps didn't come from such a good home, came with a bad record in his previous school, and you managed to get to do, there's a lot of satisfaction if you can kid yourself that it's something to do with you. So it's a selfish satisfaction.
You've trained for owner breeders most successfully over a number of years, Cheveley Park and Miss Rousing, to name but two.
McDonald Buchanan's, Fairhavens.
Yeah.
You know, I started with owner breeders, and, and I absolutely relish training horses who I've had their grandmother, their great-grandmother. And
not so common now.
No.
Sadly.
And Guy Harwood, of course, he's such a lovely man, and I remember I was underbidder to Guy for 2 or 3 really good horses in succession, and Guy was going very well, and he had marvellous owners, and there were a lot of property men, and they were spending big at the sales. And very kindly, not unkindly, Guy said, "Mark, get rid of those, owner breeders." He said, "They're holding you back. You want some people with proper money, And anyway, shortly afterwards, of course, the recession came, and those kind of owners with the property were just struggling and not able to go to the sales so much. And the owner breeders, of course, are left with more horses that they can't sell, and therefore probably send you more horses. So they're a marvellous sort of safety base to have. And I saw a guy not so long ago, and he's such a lovely man. He remembered what he'd said, and he said, "I say to Amanda, look after those owner breeders." So I've been very lucky. I think probably it's less, it's so you're not getting so much of the instant horses, and you've got to put up with ones that are perhaps less well conformed and so on, but it's tremendously satisfying to have owner breeders. Yeah.
Tell me about the story which relates to you leading one round of the Gold Cup for Mr. Kendall and behind Arkle, and you choosing to have Alberado.
King's nephew.
Yeah.
And when I was
Stan
with Mr. Kendall's, Stan rode him, and there was only 4 or 5 runners, I think, and it was a bitterly cold day, the old parade ring. They started round the corner there at Cheltenham, and I trudged round leading old King's nephew round, who was a thoroughly good horse, but was due to get well whacked by them. And in front of me was Arkle, and who hadn't yet quite attained the invincibility that was to come. But it was a very noticeable thing when you walked behind him was his hocks swung out each time as he walked, and his foot actually pivoted. And it's thought by a lot of very good horsemen to be a pretty significant fault. But even somebody as dozy as me was able to work out, trudging around circuit after circuit, that this is what he did. So years and years later, I think it was the second ever horse I had for Miss Rousing. I went to Staffordstown, and there were a couple of nice fillies there, and one of them had this walk and a very big, broad rib cage, but otherwise was perhaps less attractive than the other one. And I think slightly to Miss Rousing and Julian, the stud managers, slightly, I think, to their surprise, I think it's very kind of you. I think I'd like to have that one, you see. And it was entirely thanks to trudging round after Arkle, because Alberado did that and won 2 champion stakes, and thank goodness became a very, very successful mare for Miss Rousing as well. So.
And the
on little things.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it wonderful?
On little
things. It's great, on little things, absolutely. And that second champion stakes, Sir Mark, that was, if I may say so, one of your greatest training feats.
Yeah, because she'd been no good that year.
Yeah, she struggled, hadn't she, to even race.
Yeah, she was no good. And we couldn't get her to go. And we, in the middle of the season, she sort of came healthy, and I think she went for the Nassau and slipped up. Well, not didn't fall over, but slipped on the turn. But she just was showing nothing. And Miss Rousing's wonderfully patient. When they're good enough to win with her homebreds, she will keep going. I've had 4. Alberado won her 2 Group 1s when she was 5. How many owner breeders would have kept her racing when she was 5? But Miss Rousing will stick at it. And Alberado was going no good at home, and I kept ringing and saying, you know, she's not showing anything, and so on and so on. Hasn't run for a year, and so on. And anyway, the denouement came, and Miss Rousing said, well, don't run her unless you think she's going to win. Now, that's quite a task.
No
with
pressure.
Her. So I said, oh dear, well, I said, you've set the show jump high there. She's going to work on Thursday or whatever. And we had a wonderful old lead horse called Farmost, and he had led her in her gallop the year before, and she went over racecourse side, and they repeated the gallop absolutely to a pound that the year before when she'd won that. So I rang Miss Rousing and I said, I haven't a clue whether Alberado will win the Champion Stakes, but Farmost says she will. and she did.
So she suddenly blossomed.
Yeah, suddenly came.
Yeah.
But waited. She kept on getting set fast, didn't look quite right, and suddenly came good. And it was a great day. It was a great day on the July course. And everything went our way because High Rise was in the race, Luca. And Luca had got a pacemaker for him, which they'd supplemented at a vast fee just to... And bad luck for Luca was High Rise was drawn one side and the pacemaker's the other. And I said to George, you're very lucky, George, you're right behind the pacemaker. I said, if you can get him behind the pacemaker, High Rise, who was very keen, he's going to be out to one side, and this should go our way. And it was like playing one of those football games, you know, with the magnets, and it just went all my way.
Yeah.
As soon as she was out, George had her straight in behind the pacemaker. Poor High Rise, pull in and tuck in.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
It was meant to be. And how did Albanova compare to her? She came along a little bit later on. Did she stay better?
Full sister. I always thought that Alberado was probably just the better.
Right.
Albanova was the better looking. Right. But who knows? To get 2 full sisters as good as that, you're
incredible.
Very, very lucky. Yeah.
And they both produced loads of winners too.
They did. They didn't produce anything as good as themselves. And everybody always says with these good mares, oh, they didn't produce. Well, it's very difficult for them to. If you've been the best mare of the last 10 years, it's pretty hard to.
It is, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They'll say Frankel's a failure now, won't they?
That's right.
For the same logic.
So no, they were marvellous fillies to have, and you know she breeds great horses there. You know. And I bought colts off there, which had won stacks of races, Foreign Affairs. What was he called? The horse who went to Hong Kong. We won 5 million out there. We bought him for 29. You know, they're very commercial at the sales. Time Warp.
Time Warp, that's right. Well remembered. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
You know, so she's to have a breeder like that is marvellous. When I started, I had the Donald Buchanans and the Fairhavens, but you were raking over the embers of what had been great studs. So it's marvellous to have Cheveley Park and Miss Rousing, who are very active and improving all the time.
Another good filly you had who was very talented. I remember a turn of foot was sparkling. Last Second, owned by Prince Faisal.
She could quicken. And of course she was the same family.
Yes.
And I with Paul Webber, I bought Last Second for Prince Faisal. And because she did well, Miss Rousing sent me Alberado, who was very closely related.
Yes.
And because she did well, Mrs. Rogers sent me Alleluia. So just one having Last Second transformed my training career, really. She was really good.
So she was important.
But she was fragile, bad eater. After her races, she used to car away and look like she'd had 6. And I was still in my punting days in those days, and we'd had a spring where the horses were wrong, And I think I had my first runner on Derby Day. The first runner on Derby Day. You need nerves of steel to do that. And last second, but I had some good horses. And last second and Pivotal had not, neither of them had run that year, and they were heading to Ascot. And Pivotal won the King's Stand, and he'd done a couple of bits of work with Last Second, who was well capable of going with him.
Was she?
Yeah, you know, she could go. And they used to bowl on together, not off the bridle, but they could go together.
Yeah.
And he won the King's Stand a short head, unfortunately beating poor Jack Berry with Mind Games, and Jack never did win a Group 1 short head. And then the next day or the day after, Last Second was running, and she was quite edgy filly, and in my top hat I was walking down with George Duffield down to parade. There was a proper parade in those days. You had to walk all the way down in number, do you remember?
Yeah, I do.
And turn and canter back. And she was just beginning to get a bit edgy. And we passed the bookmakers, and they were right on the rails there by the cheap enclosure. And this fellow got 66 to 1 Last Second.
No.
I said, "You're on your own." I was over the rail before I could say no. I mean, this had just worked with the thing that won the King's Stand. So I was over the rail, and I bumped into Fenton Kerwin, who was a big punter Irishman. And I said, "Get on, Fenton, everything." He said, "Jesus, how much?" I said, "Don't worry, just get it on, there's no time."
Yeah.
And on and on and on we got it. And she got beat a short head.
Oh.
But I remember saying to George, "You're on your own here." This thing's bouncing about. I was gone.
With your top hat on. Fair play to you.
And the first fella I jumped into was Fenton Kerwin.
My goodness me. Can we talk a bit more about Pivotal? Because, I mean, he was a freak, really, wasn't he?
Yeah.
To have that speed with that pedigree.
Yes, he was an extraordinary horse, fascinating horse to train, because when I went to the stud, Cheveley Park, Mr. Richardson went round the yearlings, and Mr. Thompson was there that year, and they said, "Well, do you like the horses that you're having?" And I said, "I do, thank you very much." They said, "Well, there's one here that I'm afraid you've got to have in that case to make up the weight," and that was Pivotal. And he was standing in a dip, I can see it now, and he looked very heavy and unathletic. He was the first covering of his sire, first covering the sire ever made.
Polo Falcon.
And it was the first foal of the mare, and neither did as well again. Extraordinary.
Yeah.
He was, when he arrived here, he fell off the lorry, I couldn't remember, clumsy. And Colin, my marvellous head lad, Colin Nutter, said, "And what are we to do with this?" And he looked unathletic at that stage. And by the time we'd broken him, got him cantering, he was fine, but again, just a horse. And then we worked him in the autumn. In those days, we just put down a fibre sound gallop, the first new all-weather in Newmarket outside here, and he absolutely flew. You know when people say, "I've got no idea it was any good." Well, I had no idea till then, but he absolutely flew. And I rang Chris Richardson, who, of course, runs the stud so skillfully, and I said, "When you did the mating, what distance did you think this horse would need?" And so Chris said, "Well, sprinter, miler, down." I said, he said, "Maybe 1.1 miles, 1.25 miles." So I said, well, unless I'm mad, I think he sprints. No, I don't think so. He mustn't need anyway. So we started him over 6, and he was fine but clueless at Newbury, and then he beat the track record over 5 at Folkestone, and he just got faster and faster. And when he went to stud, this trait of not being able to work out his distance easily, this trait became apparent in his stock, because in the very first year he was at stud, I had one out of a mare of Mrs. Phillipson's who'd won 4 races over 1 mile and 6, and it won the Abernant. And I had one out of a very fast mare, Danehurst mother, and she'd been July Cups and all that sort of thing, and that was won the Prix Penelope 1.25 miles. So it seemed to me very early on that the problem of assessing their distance was always going to be there. The one thing is they were pretty good, and it was up to you to make up your mind you got the distance right.
Yes.
And his success at stud has been phenomenal. I read somewhere, a better judge than me, that he's probably the 5th best home-based sire since the war. Probably he is. And of course for Cheveley Park, he's been simply wonderful, and founded the expansion of what is our biggest home-bred, home-based breeders that we have got.
Yeah, all power to them.
And Pivotal was the foundation. So, and he won his 2 group races by short heads, as we said, beating Mind Games, and then poor Henry Candy, we beat him a short head in the number.
That's right. Evening Performance, wasn't it?
Yeah, Evening Performance.
Yeah.
And Duffield at his most forceful, teeth baring, and they suited one another.
And I hadn't realised that the Cheveley Park's first ever homebred classic in their own colours was Confidential Lady.
That's right. So we were lucky. We trained for them their first homebred Group 1 winner, which was Pivotal, their first homebred Group winning Stallion, and their first homebred classic winner, which was Confidential Lady. So they've done me wonderfully well.
And you them, of course. But I mean, she ran here, didn't she, in the Guineas?
She did. Got beat by Mrs. Sly.
Yeah.
By Mrs. Sly. And I remember her passing me. I said, "Mrs. Sly, you are a nuisance." And she was so excited going to meet Speciosa, and then she won the French Oaks, which was a really exciting day. I was here, and I turned on the telly, and I saw she was 4-1, and I thought, well, it's marvellous. It just shows how the French respect my training, because obviously because a form wouldn't have her at 4-1. I thought they really do respect my training. And I looked again; it was 40-1, 40-1, and I did get moving then. I got about 7 or 10 minutes.
Speed of Pivotal.
Yes, the speed of Pivotal at last second, and managed to avail myself of.
Wonderful,
yeah.
Wonderful.
And Seb rode her, and it was a great day. Jean-Claude Rouget, who'd never won a classic, who's a great friend of mine, he had the 2nd and the 3rd. So I was beginning to feel I kept on denying Jack Berry, Henry Candy, Monsieur Rouget, all my sort of pals, yes. But of course, Mr. Rouget's not stopped ever since.
There was a little bit of controversy after the French Oaks because they had Seb Sanders in, didn't they? They banned him for excessive use of the whip.
I think it was
an interesting talking point for us.
I think it was probably overdoing it, but the great thing was he made a certainty of a great day, Seb, and he was just a wonderful jockey. There was a stage when Seb, you could watch him riding one, and he's pushing and shoving. I remember being in Ireland, and a whole group of Irish trainers were standing around watching one of mine run and seeing Seb pushing, and they all said, well, you're beaten out so pushing. And I said, he thinks he's going to win, pushing. And the wretched thing won, And he pulled himself up by his bootlaces to be champion jockey, absolutely by his bootlaces. And the tragedy was that the year after he broke his leg so badly riding one of Lucas at Chester, and thereafter was the magic, was the catch up was so difficult, and he was but he was some jockey at that time. But the whip ban, yes, of course, I've long been an advocate of that. If the whip rule is broken, there shouldn't be a ban, there shouldn't be a suspension, there shouldn't be a fine. Just lose the race, and they'll never do it. And if we're
stop.
Yeah, never do it. If we're serious about animal welfare and wanting to create the right impression, the rule is there. All we've got to do is enforce it. I think it's so simple. I cannot understand why everybody doesn't immediately sign up to it. If I was a jockey in a close finish, I want to know what the other man can do. Now it's optional. They can go over the limit if they like or not. They might pay afterwards, but they can't lose the race. So if I was a jockey, I'd like it. If I'm a punter, I'd like it because I want them to be running under the same rule.
Yes.
And the animal rights people, you could say we're serious. And most important of all, if we don't do that, in my opinion, we will lose the whip altogether, which is absolutely what I don't think we should do. And lastly, of course, we've got the example of coursing, which was my great love. And 30 odd years ago, the Irish put muzzles on the dogs because nobody wants to see a hare killed. They go coursing to see the dogs work. The English didn't. The Irish are still coursing, and the English aren't. So if we don't impose our own, if we don't back up our own rule, I think we will lose the whip, and it will be another step on the slippery slope.
And back to that day at Chantilly, having snaffled a bit of the 40-1, how would you have felt about that then?
Well, under those rules, if the rules were operating, I'm confident that Seb wouldn't have exceeded it.
Right, okay, yeah.
He could count very well, I found, Seb.
You remain steadfastly single, albeit you gave away the game early on when you said at the age of 11 your head had been turned by a pretty girl.
Yes. And it's been a problem all my life. It's been a problem. Just easily distracted has been a problem for me.
But you've never been tempted to get hitched?
No, I've always felt that I wasn't very much suited to it. And I always remember when back 50 years ago, all my friends, it was very exciting and they all wanted to go and live with someone and thought this was a big adventure. And I used to say I'll live with anyone as long as they don't want to marry me. It was the marrying was the difficult part. I just didn't feel like signing up, I think. And I've enjoyed thinking time, and I think the great advantage of being a bachelor is you have thinking time. So when you come home in the evening and the horses run badly, there's no one to say that Kieran's got a bad school report, Hannah's fallen downstairs and the Brussels sprouts are off. It's quiet. I can think about it, and I think I've enjoyed thinking time.
And indulging your hobbies as well.
Yes, and I've had lots to interest me. I like the theatre, I like arts, I like coursing. I follow all of them very carefully, even if I can't go as much as I like. But I follow them very carefully. I have Antiques Trade Gazette and the boxing, yeah. So I follow them all, even if I don't get to them as much as I would like.
So a pretty rounded life, all in all.
I've been a very lucky life. I've enjoyed it, and I've had good people through my hands. I've enjoyed all the assistant trainers, their success, and hopefully, so you have that nice feeling that it'll go on a bit longer anyway. I've enjoyed their successes, and William, poor chap, is well ready to start training. Bad news comes when Jim Bulger wins his second in a classic when he's nearly 80. I say, now there, William, there you are. You see all the... So, poor William. Everybody in the town says that, poor William. But he's well ready to do it. But I enjoy I get up very early and I work as hard as I can, and I thoroughly enjoy it.